Okay, this now.
So I'll jump back in, and we're talking about
What is poetry?
yeah, what is poetry, and
Yes.
and comparing it with jazz music, and how the jazz musician, any musician, jazz or not, has to learn their instrument. Then they're free to create and to write on the instrument. The instrument for the poet is a blank page and a pen, and words. Words are the poet's paint. Words are the poet's stone. Words are the poet's clay. It's the medium in which the poet works. And so the more command you have of whatever language it is you're working in, the better poetry you will write. If you don't have a good vocabulary, your poetry is going to be pretty shallow. If you don't have an appreciation of the music in different words, your poetry is going to be kind of dull. So these are some of the skills you have to, by practice, just begin to learn.
Now, how does your society, especially back in Austin, Texas, develop a culture of poetry? That's become very evident.
It's almost kind of by swimming against the stream, so to speak, because poets are oftentimes their own worst enemy. In Austin, for example, we have the academic poets at the University of Texas, very prestigious school. And then we have what we call the street poets. These are poets that just come in off the street, they aren't affiliated with anybody else. And then there's the Poetry Society poets. These are people who belong to the Austin Poetry Society. And then there are what we call the slam poets. And you probably have slam here in Singapore, or performance poetry, very dramatic and so forth. The problem is that none of these poetic groups speak to each other. They each live in their own little universe. And so poetry is handicapped by that because there's strength in numbers. And if everybody would work together, poetry would have a much greater impact on society. But everybody kind of stays in their own little bailiwick. And so Austin has become the poetry place that it is because kind of each of these groups has influenced their own sphere of peers, and poetry is doing very well in Austin. But you will almost never find a reading where there's a broad mix of those different poets. In other words, a performance poet, a street poet, an academic poet, etc. You'll have to go to a slam event and they'll be all performance poets. You'll go to the university, here the academics read. You'll go to what they call the open mics, and we have open mics here in Singapore.
Oh yes, it is.
Yeah, open mics, you're going to hear the street poets.
Now, how about the historical background? How did Austin become one of those revered places to be?
Well, I can only give you maybe a sampling of that because I've lived in Austin about 15 years. And Austin goes back much, much farther than that. But probably 20 years ago, there was a venue in Austin called Chicago House. And it was a place, it was a bar basically, that allowed the poets to come in and have a reading, probably once a week. And so that was kind of the mecca for the poets to begin to come together and to read, and poetry to kind of begin to get a community. Then over the years, any number of different venues began to say, hey, I want you to come over here, do a reading over here. And then a number of poets who saw how that worked went to venues and said, hey, I want to start a reading here. And so today, any night of the week, you'll have a choice of at least 2 different venues where you can go and listen to poetry.
Wow.
Some nights 3.
And then who's the founder, do you know?
There's no founder, it's all different people just having gone out and sort of found their venue, and they shepherd it, they take care of it.
So it just happened by accident?
Well, not really accident, it happened by I would call it by modeling. Somebody saw this person do it and said, oh, I'm going to do that over here, so they went and did it over here. And the venues are always looking for ways to bring business in. In fact, I'm speaking on poetry and business. This is a great example of how poetry and business can help each other. A lot of these spaces are coffee houses. I don't know what you would call them here, but I spoke last time I was here at a coffee house, I would call it that. They served coffee and light refreshments, and it was a bookstore. I don't know where that was, but
Okay.
why would a bookstore want to have poetry read there other than the fact that they sell poetry? Well, because it brings people into the bookstore. So the same is true with these cafes, these bistros, these bars, whatever they are. They found that they could get people to come to their establishment by letting the poets come and read there. And so the poets then found a place because the business wanted to draw people in. So both groups benefited by that. And Austin is a very friendly town, and so it just naturally flourished there. We just finished the Austin International Poetry Festival, which is the largest non-juried festival in the United States. Kirpal Singh from Singapore here was a featured poet there. He was an international poet. And we had about 200 poets present for that festival, and we probably had 40 venues across Austin.
Oh, wow.
Which
Amazing.
Good sampling of how many venues are involved in supporting, or at least promoting poetry, giving it a place to be read.
Now, speaking about the business of poet and poet for the business, how does Asia itself, right here in Asia, could learn from your model back in Austin? What I know that you have come to Asia a couple of times and you have seen what's happening around. How can a country or a town, even like Singapore, can learn from you?
Well, I mean, I think that art, whatever form it is, painting, sculpting, acting, music, poetry, literature of any kind, I think art in itself offers society abundant possibilities that are not there if that society abandons its art. We're in a world that is technologically going forward at lightning speed. But our sort of philosophical side has not kept up with that. What are the implications of all of this technology for our society, for our people? One of the great poets said that, it was Shelley, that the poets are the true legislators of the world. Now, many people would listen to that and go like, oh, that's crazy. But what he was saying was that poets have the power to truly change society. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, in Plato's Republic, he forbid poetry. Poetry was not allowed. In his model utopian society, poetry was forbidden. You say, well, how could that be if it's so wonderful? That's the very reason it was kicked out, because it was so wonderful. It was too powerful to be contained by a state. And so Plato said, I don't want poetry in my republic. So poetry has immense power, and its power is related to what I would call, and not necessarily in a religious sense or a spiritual sense, but what I would call just generally the soul of humankind. It tends to humanize us, so that we are not just technocrats going around with no feelings, with our iPhones plugged in and our minds wandering off. And we talked about that today at the conference, about the effect of nations being in isolation, not because there are walls built anymore, like there was through Berlin, but rather the walls are in our ears. You ride a bus, even in Austin, you ride a bus. I'll bet you half the passengers have their iPhones plugged into their ears. They don't talk to each other anymore. What does that do to a society when you're that blocked off? Poetry, music, arts opens that up, opens that world up, and gives us the means to look at the world, to look at our life with a soulful perspective, to balance the science of our life.
Now, you said that our society is moving towards much more isolated.
Yes.
Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, both. Let me use the example of medicine. When I was a young person and I had to go see the doctor, I would go see what we called a GP, a general practitioner. And if I had a cold, he'd fix that. If I had a broken leg, he'd fix that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were only a few specializations in medicine then. Maybe a surgeon, or maybe a heart doctor and the general GP. Now, when I go see my family doctor, if something in my eye, I see a different doctor. I go see an eye doctor. If something is in my ear, I go see an ear doctor. If my foot is hurt, I go see a foot doctor. So the specialization there is such that no longer can I go to just a few people to get my needs met. I have to go to maybe 50 different doctors to take care of my body. So that gets life much more complicated. Now, the positive side of that is that the guy who's going to see my foot probably knows a heck of a lot more about feet than anybody else in any other medical profession. So there's a trade-off for it. But what I'm saying is that specialization by itself is neither good nor bad. It's what you make of it, what comes from it. And in specialization, we tend to lose sight of the rest of our world. I'm so focused on feet, I don't care about ears, eyes, nose, etc. And same thing in terms of vocation. Let's say you're an engineer, and engineering has gotten highly specialized. And so as we get specialized like that, we lose our connections to other aspects of the world that we live in. In the political sphere, it becomes very obvious the impact on society, because we can have people who are tightly tied to political points of view, who are hotly opposed to other people and don't understand that they're just other people. Instead of being an other person, you become one of them. In reality, who's the them? We're all them. We're all people. But isolated ideas can make all of us who would be one into very divided groups of people. And that's another way that I think poetry is helpful, because poetry is a universal language. There are poems that have been around for thousands of years that still have meaning for us today.
I totally agree. And speaking about meaning, how can poets around the world, especially in Singapore, because it's such a young, developed country itself, trying to find their feet, and trying to find a way to make it a viable business for them. Could you give us some 3 key advice on how they can go about doing so, and what sort of processes that involves?
Well, yeah, this is what I would say to that. I would say you don't have to make it your business to be a poet. In other words, I'm also a businessman. I have several businesses that I run. Many great American poets and British poets were also business people. Bankers, farmers, insurance salesmen, surgeons, doctors, but they were also great poets. So the limitation is not that you have to be exclusively a poet or something else. You can be both. The limitation, and I experienced this my last trip to Singapore. I was here for the first annual American Poetry Festival, again, that Dr. Singh put together. And there were poets from several different places who came in, and we had students who came and met with us. And the group that I was meeting with wanted to ask me, how do we write poetry? And so I gave them some pointers, and then asked them just to write. And what I found was that the limitation for them was that they lacked confidence in themselves. That somehow they didn't feel that they had the capacity to be poetic. And yet when we sat in one of the hotels in the lobby and they were writing, many of the things that they wrote were really wonderful, really wonderful. Doesn't mean they were perfect or finished, but they clearly had the capacity to write if they would give themselves that opportunity. And so the limitation for them was really sort of a cultural lid that they were keeping on themselves. And I don't know that enough about Singaporean culture to know where that comes from, because this was an ethnically mixed group, as Singapore is. So it was not like just the Chinese students felt that, or the Malay students, or whatever. Everybody in the group was struggling with sort of letting go and letting the words flow. And I couldn't quite put my hand on why that was, but that was the limitation. And that's the limitation for many people in, I think, in probably any of the arts, is the willingness to just let yourself go and get into the art. Let it happen. And then develop the skills as you go along. But the first step is to be able to sort of let yourself go. I'll give you an example from when I took acting at UCLA. I went into the acting class, and we did scenes from different plays and so forth. And let's say that I'm doing a scene where I have to be a policeman. So I thought, in my first semester in this class, I thought, how would a policeman behave? And I worked on that. How would a policeman behave? And my director, the acting class instructor, said, "You're going about it all wrong." He said, "You are the policeman. How would you behave?" Well, it was a totally different experience. And what I had to learn to do was not to learn to be like a policeman. I had to learn to be like me. Now, for most of us, that's very difficult, because we're very guarded. And I think probably Singaporean culture is very guarded. You are a very polite, a very decorous people. And so to sort of let it all hang out, it's a little uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable for me in those acting classes to just let it go. And yet it was also deeply spiritual, because when I did that, some of the things that I was afraid other people who saw in me would say, "Ooh," they said, "Oh, that was great. You were wonderful." You go like, "Whoa, that's cool." So it's having the capacity to be able to sort of let yourself go and get into the art, and not worry about what somebody is going to think or say about you. And that, I think, is one of the things that the students I was working with here were really struggling to get past.
Amazing, and well said as well. Now, let's move forward. After the business of being a poet, management-wise, has anyone actually managed your career?
No.
No.
But I do know poets in Texas, where I live, who have agents, but they have money. An agent takes money, and there's an adage. It's an adage in the States that no poet makes money on their poetry. If you want to make money on poetry, you teach poetry. So let's say a very famous American poet, Maya Angelou, she didn't make money on her poetry. She made money on activities around her poetry. So if you're looking at a vocation to make a living out of, poetry probably isn't the best thing to look at. If you're looking at an activity that can enrich your life as you work here, there, wherever to make a living, poetry is wonderful. It's wonderful. And that's how many of the great American poets, let's say Wallace Stevens, for example, that's how he made it. He made his living in business, but he wrote poetry on the side, and he's recognized now as one of the finest American poets of the last century. And so that's the path that I would recommend to most people, because I think I'd find it hard to find a poet, past or present, who really made a living off of their poetry alone. Just doesn't happen.
Huh. Well said. No, thank you for your advice. Now, let's move forward about your work and your readings. So, now, some people may have wondered and they want to ask, and that is, has poetry actually affected the way you write, you perceive life, especially you have just got one arm?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, as I said, I grew up on a large cattle ranch, and when I was 4 years old, I got caught in a tractor. I don't know if Singaporeans know what a tractor is, because you're pretty much an urban nation. But a tractor is a big machine that pulls farm implements when they plant crops and harvest crops and what have you. And my arm got caught in part of the mechanisms of that tractor. And so at 4 years old, I lost my left arm. And to answer your question more directly, has poetry changed or amended my life in any way? I wouldn't be alive today without poetry. As a child, I battled a lot of depression, and poetry gave me a way to write about that. And again, poetry is powerful in that it enables you to contain that pain, go visit it again, and visit it in a safe way that doesn't hurt you, doesn't harm you, but rather is healing. Many, many poets have used poetry for their own, let's call it self-soothing, to process issues that they're dealing with. Now, there's poetry far beyond that, but for many poets, myself included, that was an important part of the attraction of poetry. Early on, I also learned, because I had one arm, and if I'm going to, let's see, be at school and I'm with a bunch of strong boys who have two arms, do you think that I want to tangle physically with them? Probably as a last resort. So what other means do I have to defend myself? Words. Have you heard the saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never harm me? That's a saying in the States. It's an absolute lie. Because you know and I know, you've probably had things said to you that were very painful, yes?
Oh, yeah.
Aha. So words can be powerfully painful. So I don't have to hit you. I can say it with my mouth if I know the right words and be terribly brutal to you. So I learned early on the power of words, and I was amazed at the power of words. I would get into a situation maybe with another person in my class, and I would get my way out of it with words. And I went like, oh, that was cool. I almost got my butt kicked. Instead, I give him a whipping with my tongue. Call it a tongue lashing. and you know, so I learned maybe inappropriately, but I still learned the power of words. And so as I became an adult, I said, wow, what a gift to have words work for you in such a powerful way. Now, if you're in business, if you don't understand the power of words, you're not going to go very far in business. So I also teach courses in communication. And it's not about poetry, it's about communication. And I teach people different aspects of communication and how important what they say, how they say, when they say is. And poetry has all that bundled in as well.
And so, tell me something about anger management. Has that helped you to
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Your anger?
Yes, absolutely.
How did you overcome anger?
A lot by expressing it in a constructive way. I'm also a psychologist. And so, in working with people who come in to see me who have anger issues, there was for a short time in the States, there was the idea if you give them a punching bag and let them just, hit the bag and get it all out. And what we found out fairly quickly was that didn't work. That made them just more angry because they were activating that anger. But if we gave them a means to express the anger in a positive way, in a constructive way, the anger went down. Poetry can do that.
Huh. So if I was angry after a hard day's work with my boss and my colleagues and my
you wrote a poem about it, you would be ever so much better.
Really?
No question about it.
Write a poem about it.
Exactly. And if you don't want to write a poem, do a journal entry. Write a journal.
Really? Okay.
Writing it out, the kinesthetics of writing is very therapeutic, very helpful.
Huh.
You're dispersing that energy.
Wow. Now, speaking about energy itself and
Yes.
dispersing, could you, help us by indulging a few of your works that you have written,
Oh, sure.
of your reading, and because what I do understand is that Mr. McKinsey himself has written a number of poems, and he's going to do some reading for us, for you, our viewers.
Now, this is one that you'd mentioned I lost my arm as a boy, and so Growing up on this farm, again, we had very large equipment, very dangerous equipment. And back when I was a child, that equipment was not very well protected. The dangerous parts were not very well protected. Today, there's all kinds of regulations, and their machines are still powerful and dangerous, but they have guards and things that keep the dangerous parts away from body parts and so forth. When I was a kid, they didn't, and so I would be sent out by my father to drive a tractor in a field with a plow behind it. And in doing that, most of that farm equipment is meant to run with two hands. For example, many people will say, well, how do you drive a car? And I go, with one hand.
No, that's a miracle.
Well, my favorite thing is I like to tell people about when I go fishing. I like to tell them about the fish that I caught. Because they will always ask, well, how big was the fish? And I'll say, well, it's about that big.
Huh.
Now, if you were going to tell me how big a fish was, what would you do? Let's say you caught a 1 foot long fish. How would you show me that?
I don't know, probably this much.
Yeah, that's what you do, but I go like this. How big's my fish?
Well, that's pretty big.
You have no idea, do you?
Yeah, I have no idea.
So you got to have fun with it. Okay. So this is a poem that I wrote. I dedicated this to my father. It's called The Plow. I remember plowing on the farm. The corners were the hardest with one arm, but Dad had taught me with his trust to spin the wheel and then to thrust hydraulics up and down again with speed, and showed me with each conquered weed that life is like a field to spade, whose working yields a silvered blade, reflecting all around its light and giving peaceful sleep at night. And now I live in concrete fields where sidewalk cracks grow meager yields of weeds or grass, which seem sublimely in a place unkept untimely, trying boldly for the sky, unheralded by each passerby. But I look down with fonder gaze, remembering those farming days where furrows turned to polished steel, and then a strange communion feel with weeds who've conquered man-made stone and beat the odds and fully grown, and see myself as plow and ground, and wonder at the things I've found, and where I've come from, then till now, and know it started on that plow.
Wow, amazing.
So that captures a lot of my experience, on the farm with one hand, and it also sort of captures for me in a very nice capsule my journey through life to where I am today. And I know that it started learning on that plow that I could do it. I could run a plow, which was very complicated, much more complicated than driving a car. I could do it with one hand.
Huh.
So that poem captures that for it. And the other one I'll share with you, you mentioned that my editing a journal, this is Ardent here. And this was in Ardent, and this is called Poetic Passage. And this, I think, will help to give an illustration of how poetry can have such a force in someone's life. So this is called Poetic Passage. I cannot write beneath the weight of death. The falling leaves curtail my languid pen, until I note their color massing on the chilly ground, and how they dance when prompted by the slightest breeze. Now let me just stop there and just give you a little interpretation of this. So I begin to say, I can't write when I'm thinking about death. That's kind of a heavy subject, right? You ever catch yourself thinking about death?
Oh, that's
It
scary.
kind of absorbs your mind, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So I say, I can't write when I'm thinking about death. But then I go out and see, you don't have seasons here, so your trees don't shed their leaves. But where I live, we have seasons, and so in winter, the trees shed their leaves. And when that happens, the leaves fall, they turn a beautiful bunch of colors, and they dance in the breeze on the ground. So I see that death of these leaves, and I see them dancing, and it gives me a whole new perspective on what it means to die. So let me start over again, you'll get the picture.
Okay.
So, I cannot write beneath the weight of death. The falling leaves curtail my languid pen, until I note their colors massing on the chilly ground, and how they dance when prompted by the slightest breeze. I cannot write in sorrow's crushing pain, the wildebeest beneath the rending claw, until in birth The lioness relents, and furry cubs come tumbling forth to life. I cannot write amidst my noisy life, where carnal jangles jingle in my mind, until I hear that sweet stream's inner voice that babbles as my assuaged spirit sings. For then I write as though the wind were words, as though the ocean and her colors ink, and I am taken through the magic of a poem where words alone could never find their way.
Wow, amazing. And speaking of which, before we end, of course, there are a few more, just two more
Sure.
things. You have a wonderful costume. I really like your
My
vest.
sister made this. Is my poetry vest. My sister made it
Wow.
for me.
Is there any significance about the color and the gold and this this
I like
jewelry? Is there some kind of like a significant kind of like
Feng shui? No feng shui. Just
Oh, no,
I like it.
Does it, or is it something that represents you and
No. Just well, it's artsy. That represents my artsy side. But in terms of the
Okay.
color, or no, it's just pretty,
Wow. Now,
festive.
now before we have just this maybe perhaps I think it's the last question, and that is before before you die, what would be the 3 key life lessons that you would like to impart to the future generations?
The only time that you have to change anything is now. You can't change the past. You don't know the future. So the time to live is now. 2, understand that you are always going to be imperfect. Because if you think you can be perfected, you will never be happy. And 3, learn to love.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
Those are my 3 toppies.
Well, Mr. Dillon McKinsey, thank you for joining us here at the National Critics' Choice, and I truly admire your career, and I mean, I was surprised that you're a psychiatrist as well.
Psychologist.
Psychologist. I'm sorry.
I don't do drugs.
And yes, and and you're also a programmer on radio
Yes.
as well, and
Yes.
you've done plenty of that.
And a businessman.
And a
See, that's
businessman
what we're
too.
doing, poetry and business here. So I have a number of businesses that I run as well.
Wow. Now, how did you manage to balance work life and family life with all these activities going on?
I'm not sure that I could honestly say that I've always balanced it well. I'm what in the States we would call a type A person, so I always have 4 or 5 different things going on. I'm not happy to be sitting idle at any one time. I don't like vacations for that reason. I don't want to go someplace and sit. I want to go someplace. I love coming to Singapore, but I love coming to Singapore to work. I think I'd go stir crazy just sitting somewhere doing nothing. So it's just my nature to always work. And yes, it's difficult at times to get your priorities straight. Obviously, when you're younger, you're not as wise. Hopefully, as I've gotten older, I'm a grandfather now. So I'm a much better grandpa than I was a parent.
Now,
That just comes with the turf.
what advice would you give for seniors in Asia, especially Singapore? Because there are seniors who are afraid of going past life. That is, after they retire, they don't even know what they're going to do next. And
Well, this is one of the blessings of picking up an art. Because when you retire, then you can give much more time to that art. Let's say you start painting when you're in business, or let's say you start sculpting, or writing poetry, whatever. When you retire, you've gained the skill to really be good at it when you retire. And you can just thrive in that art after you retire and have plenty to do.
Yeah. Now, what's your secret of staying